talk is Neoliberalism and Civic Engagement, Who's Watching the Chicken Coop. And what's kind of funny about my giving this talk is that I'm somebody who was nominated for a national award. That was the reason why I was at the conference that Over was at. I was nominated by my university president for a National Campus Compact Award for being civically engaged faculty of the year. And I didn't win the award, I was a finalist, so I was on a finalist panel at this conference talking about my getting the award, or talking about my thoughts on civic engagement as a result of being nominated for this award and being a finalist. And the title of my talk, though, implies, of course, actually kind of, I think, states it outright, that although I'm somebody who's been very involved through a research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota, I teach in a city with about 70,000 people. In Minnesota, that's a city. It's called St. Cloud. I teach at St. Cloud State University, which is roughly, I'd say, kind of the equivalent of West Oahu. It wouldn't be UH because we're not a research university, but we're sort of on the equivalent of West Oahu. And we're primarily a teaching-based university. And in St. Cloud, there's approximately 8,000 to 10,000 newly arrived Somali refugee immigrants, and also, roughly speaking, in the St. Cloud area in Stearns County, about 3,000 to 5,000 newly arrived immigrants from either Mexico or Latin America. And in one particular town, several of these towns, they work primarily in either meatpacking companies or in the dairy industry. And the Somalis in St. Cloud work in a whole number of different industries and service sector types of work. Every single one of these places right now is covered in snow. It will be covered in more snow tomorrow, just to let you know. So I shoveled 3 inches of it before I came, and I'm happy to say I won't be shoveling any of it tomorrow. But my wife will, and I'll be hearing about it next Tuesday when I go back. So I'm for that reason, a little more happy to be here talking with you about this than talking about other people in Minnesota at the moment. But in any event, I came up with this idea about 4 years ago that we should put together a research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota. And the reason for this was because I was, like a lot of other faculty at the time, inspired by a call by our newly arrived university president, who was very excited about the university putting together different types of initiatives that would draw the university closer to the community. And so I thought, well, this would be, and he's also very excited about multiculturalism and building the reputation of the university as a diverse place and the like. So I thought, well, this is a really good way for us actually to address the multiculturalism aspect of his image that he wanted for the university, and the community outreach by addressing ourselves to, in this case, communities of color that are experiencing problems that are extremely intense, especially in terms of workplace exploitation, lack of basic labor rights, and also the ongoing threat of either detention or harassment from the INS in one form or another. In any event, whether Somali or Latino, both groups of these immigrant workers in St. Cloud are in a very precarious state and in need of support and solidarity. Since there was no one doing that kind of work in St. Cloud, and there was no real initiatives on our campus that oriented them towards the questions of the kinds of problems that immigrants face as workers in St. Cloud or in Minnesota, although there are some of these types of institutes and centers in Minnesota that are doing research on immigrants and doing work with immigrants, but primarily in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota. They're not located in St. Cloud. They're not doing work. And the ones in Minneapolis, as with all big cities, tend to focus on the big city and ignore everything outside the big city. And so when I go down to Minneapolis and I'm with the immigrant rights groups or trade unions or the like, the progressives who are supporting immigrants in one another types of struggle, when I talk about then the kind of issues that are faced in St. Cloud or Cold Spring, and encourage them to come up to Cold Spring or to St. Cloud and meet with us, it's often like pulling teeth because it's so far away. It's 70 miles, which is roughly a 1-hour drive in Minnesota. But it's really another world away for them for that. So for us in St. Cloud, this is kind of an opportunity now to do something that's not being done down there, and can also enable us to develop linkages with progressive labor activists in Minneapolis, and then combine our work in solidarity with them In any event, the president was very supportive of this idea that I floated in 2009, and he allowed us to put together what was called a research group. My original proposal was that we have a center, but he insisted with the provost that it was too early for a center, but we could begin to lay the groundwork, and we could prove that there's a need for and the capacity to develop a center that would address immigrant workers in Minnesota. I should note the only time I've ever had any issues from anyone in terms of a research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota came from fellow faculty or from deans who didn't understand why I was adding the word worker. And all I had to do was explain to them that the reason I add the word worker is because 90 to 99% of them have come here either looking for work or once they're here in a safe zone, in the case of a refugee, in desperate need for work in order to survive. And now the conditions of their work ultimately then shape the kind of ways in which they experience citizenship in this country, right? And also whether or not they're going to experience any kind of mobility individually and collectively. So I got to work putting together this research group. One of the ideas I had, Ola mentioned it earlier, was to put together every year a conference. The conference is called Global Goes Local Conference, and it's a yearly conference, usually 2 to 3 days long, which features academics, well-known academics like Ruth Milkman, David Bacon, Beza Yagmayan, Emmanuel Ness have all come and given keynote speeches at our conferences. But we've also had another feature at our conference, which is for us what stands out, and one of the reasons why I got nominated for this award ultimately. I designed the conference in a way so it wouldn't be just an academic-based conference. And that was because in 2009, I went to a conference in Omaha. And this was a very big conference, a national conference. Omaha is one of the centers of organizing Latino immigrants in the United States because of the big presence of meatpacking houses in Iowa and Nebraska and the Midwest in general. And this conference was great. A lot of very progressive, well-known academics who were very involved in supporting immigrants and immigrant rights and the like were there speaking about the issues that immigrants are facing in the United States and throughout the world. And at one point I thought, this is a really great conference, but there's only one thing that's missing at this conference, and that's immigrants. And immigrants, whether we're talking now, some of the people that were immigrants, they're immigrants in the sense of, immigrant academics. So, that's different from the immigrants who are struggling for, basic labor rights and meatpacking, I have to say. And I thought, well, since the conference is addressed towards immigrant workers, in fact, even though it never states it outright, wouldn't it be great if a conference could be put on that actually actively drew in and attracted the participation of immigrants, and especially immigrant workers, on panels, and not only attracted them to come and participate on the panels, but participate as people who are involved currently in ongoing struggles, and in ongoing struggles that reveal them as more than simply victims, but as active political agents of social change. And so we've done that now for 3 years, and this is the website for our research group, and you can see some of the things we mentioned here, who supports the School of Public Affairs and the like, and then some of the awards, the Best Community Initiative Award we received from our university, and then here the mention of my own receiving the Thomas or the Community Engagement Faculty Award and the like. And then click on this link here. You go to our webpage. This is the brochure for our conference. These are all the instructions to the panel, or the instructions to the conference and like, thank yous and the like. And then these are some of the panels and the keynote speeches that we have here. And if you look carefully through, I'm not going to go through this real carefully with you, but if you go through like so many of the panels, you see like this one, Asian American immigrant workers and families. The professor was the person who put this together, and she invited this woman Naraju Keys, who's a member of an organization that does work on for Asian immigrant women in Minnesota, and also is a nail salon worker. And her talk was about her experience in the nail salon industry and the kinds of issues that they have with environmental kind of damages caused to their primarily to their physical body, but also their mental health and the like. I'll look out there and show you a little more in here. We have one here. retail workers in a quest for a livable wage. We have a CETUR, the Centro de Trabajadores Unidos, the Center for Workers United in Struggle. So this is an immigrant workers center in Minneapolis. They brought up now 2 workers who are retail workers and retail workers organizers who are organizing retail workers at different grocery stores and outlets throughout Minneapolis. And they came and talked about the declining wages over the years, the increasing workload and the like. Now, efforts by this organization to organize these workers into a union. And actually, when I go back to Minneapolis on Tuesday, I'll land at 6 a.m. and probably my wife will drive me home, and at about noon I'll be down in Minneapolis actually picking line with these folks for the first day of a strike citywide by retail workers. Let me see if I can find one other one that might be of interest. Oh, this is a great one. Liberian, Sudanese, and Somali immigrant workers in organizing a Minnesota working home, a nursing home. And George Kie, an RN, formerly at Texas Terrace, which is a nursing home, issues that draw East African immigrant nursing workers to organize a union at Texas Terrace, which is the name of the place in Minneapolis. And this guy got fired actually, this panel, he was at this panel only because I had done a video of him, an interview with him, and then afterwards put it up on YouTube. And now at the panel, I just pulled up the YouTube video, and he was the person who was the first speaker. And he had led a campaign for a union at this nursing home, primarily of Liberian, Sudanese, and Somali workers, and they had just won the battle. But regardless, he had been fired for his involvement in the battle. And then Jeremiah Ayora, a nursing assistant, so she's one of the nursing assistants that was left over from the campaign, still working there, and she talked for about 15 or 20 minutes about that campaign. And finally, we had, his name, I know, Brenda Nelson, the organizer, the guy who actually organized the campaign from the SEIU, the Service Employees Industrial Union, was also on that panel talking about the kind of the background of the campaign, kind of, if you will, talking about it in terms of more analytical, giving kind of an analytical historical framework. And so those are just some. Now, we don't only have panels that are for people interested in organizing unions. We have panels of immigrants who have been putting together small businesses. We very broadly use the word worker here. Anybody that works, as you know, of course, small business people do work. They may not work for a boss, but outside of themselves, but they do work. And so we have panels that talk about that. We have panels of immigrants who are involved in community gardens and putting together community gardens as a way of developing alternative foods, safe foods, and also community building and the like, kind of a cultural base. We had a panel of undocumented students in Minnesota, 2 students who are undocumented who have been involved in the DREAM Act stuff going on over the last year, spoke. And these are the kind of things, by the way, I'll tell you, like that particular panel, how many people told me that's never going to happen because all these restrictions on privacy and immigrants being afraid to speak out if they're undocumented and the like. And these people typically, I find, speak with very little knowledge of the actual bravery of undocumented activists in the United States, especially at this time. Maybe 5 years ago that would have been true, but they were more than happy to even be filmed while doing these talks. So, whether there's anything else here worth mentioning? Well, they're all great. It's really exciting stuff that was done. I guess I'm tooting my own horn. But now we also have, by the way, just like every one of these panels is linked to a video, and we have all the videos up on of it on panel. So this is 2013. This is 2011, and you can go and just click on any of the links and see all of these talks and all these panels, whichever you want. So it's accessible now not only to people who came to the conference at the moment, but thanks to the virtues of YouTube and the internet, now anybody, anywhere in the world can see this. And I can tell you some of these videos actually already have somewhere between 500 to 800 contacts. So it's been a very exciting project to be part of, to direct and to lead, and all of which my talking about this in such positive ways might lead you to wonder, well, then why would I be, as it were, titling my talk Civic Engagement in Neoliberal University? Who's watching the chicken coop? And that's because despite the fact that my university president has been very supportive of our doing this work, I really do feel that there are certain constraints on it, given our mission, or at least the mission of the group, to be expressing solidarity with and be doing work in support of immigrant workers, especially those who are involved in political and social struggles. So what I thought I would do is maybe just read a little bit from a paper that I've been writing that addresses why it is that I'm, as it were, concerned about the way in which civic engagement on a neoliberal university is something which may not necessarily be as positive as my story suggests that it is. Although my story has certainly had a very positive beginning, and let's hope it continues to go that way, and we'll see. Our story is not one that has not faced challenges. Any new group or center faces obstacles when it tries to get off the ground. But despite these many positives that we've had, we've been constrained by the very force that contributed to our growth, namely the promotion of civic engagement in a neoliberal era, or neoliberal ideology. Therefore, it's necessary to clarify how neoliberal ideology has simultaneously provided the research group ground to grow, which it has. I mean, there's no way in which I can deny that that neoliberalism has made this possible. I mean, the irony of it all is that this is something that probably would not have emerged the way that it emerged in the university system as it existed 20 or 30 years ago. It might have, but it probably wouldn't have. And then also how it provides obstacles to the same, to its greater potential to fulfill the mission of civic engagement. I mean, for me, that's the important part, is that we're told constantly that our research group is really a way of delivering civic engagement, and does it in such a way that really has made our university, according to our president, kind of stand out. And certainly that was, I think, what brought about my receiving that award. That was what I was told as well when I got the award. Really stand out what you're doing. The university system today is one that's quite different from what existed only several decades ago, and the changes it will undergo in the coming future only look to make that so. As I like to put it, it seems to be getting worse and worse with every day. To begin, the notion of neoliberalism is hardly new and usually stands for what is referred to as an intense deepening of the market relation in all aspects of life, fueled by rapidly deregulated financial instruments across the globe, which have enabled corporate capital to increase reach and profits. One of the areas that has attracted the interest and the avarice of investors is the higher education, quote, market, unquote. Once taken for granted as the bedrock of post-war development, since the 1980s, U.S. public universities have received greater and greater pressure to restructure as a result of declining federal and state support. University deans and presidents and their staffs have been transformed into professional fundraisers, often spending more time off campus finding and securing private donations to make up for lost revenue. I see smiles, so obviously you're laughing. That's because you don't think it's true, right? You don't know what I'm talking about, right? This is foreign to you, right? It doesn't happen to you. Yet it is just in this time period that we have seen, especially in the last decade, a noticeable rise in excitement, despite this commercialization, commodification, a noticeable rise in excitement on the part of university administrators toward increasing the amount of campus-based civic engagement, or sometimes they call it community engagement, and collaboration with the community. How to make sense of this seeming paradox? The neoliberal university reflects the faith in, wherever possible, to turn to private markets as the primary channel of funding. Not the only one, but the primary one, or ideally the primary one. And increasingly also the source for thinking about how education is done by those who produce knowledge. Henry Giroux, a philosopher of education and a well-known critic of neoliberalism and the university system, argues the result has been an incessant encroachment on the university as a public locus for intellectual discourse and development. The legacy of public discourse, he writes, appears to have faded as the U.S. university reinvents itself by giving into the demands of the marketplace. I mean, again, think of the irony here that he's saying this at a time when universities are touting the importance of increasing community engagement, civic engagement, and the like, and a more public role for the university. Venture capitalists now scour colleges and universities in search of big profits made through licensing agreements, the control of intellectual property rights, and promoting and investing in university spin-off companies and newer and bigger buildings. This place has become very crowded since I was last here. In the age of money and profit, academic disciplines gain stature almost exclusively through their exchange value on the market. And students now rush to take courses and receive professional credentials that provide them with the cachet they need to sell themselves to the highest bidder. The traditional structures of universities, especially public universities, of university learning have likewise been transformed by revolutions in technology, most notably with the rapid and dramatic advances in computers and internet. Note the way, I'm a reflection of that, right? I once actually was putting on one of these conferences, and I was here in Hawaii, and the following week we had our conference back in Minnesota, and I was here for another conference, and I would wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, open up my computer, my iPhone, and whatever other gadgets I had ready to go to work on putting together that brochure I just told you about, and calling all over St. Cloud to different units around our campus, putting together this brochure, last minute changes and that kind of thing, and also 24/7 Facebook to get people out and become a master at kind of using every one of these new technologies, Twitter, YouTube, everything, just to get people to the conference. This has only sped up a process, however, of restructuring the learning environment on campuses in the virtual world. This restructuring of higher education learning centers on the notion of students as customers. Today's students encounter what they are told are an endless array of choices that undermine the presumption of professors that the physical and on-campus classroom is the primary site of learning. One means of attracting students is offering and encouraging professors to make available. At every term, we're being encouraged to do this. Opportunities to learn through practice and service to the community. The irony, by the way, of my receiving this award is actually I've never done service learning or any of that stuff in my classes. I teach social theory, but I've never actually done it. Mainly because I feel like they're asking me to do extra work without the time to do it, and so I just politely decline. This is consistent with patterns that have been evidenced in higher education since the late 1960s. Writes Stanley Aronowitz, two distinct movements for university reform gained momentum in the 60s. The first was the insistent demand by Black, Latino, and working class women for access to the institutions of higher education as a sign of equality as well as equality of opportunity. The second was the profound dissatisfaction of mostly white middle-class students with the growing trend toward focusing on technical scientific production and what Kerr called the multiversity. So, I mean, on the one hand, these changes are actually in reaction to some of the demands from students and radicals in the 1960s to make the university more relevant. But what it's done is, interestingly, kind of taken those demands and then redeployed them in a way that I'm going to argue is actually working out to the benefit of not the community as much as the business sector. This pattern seems to counterbalance a contradiction that underlies the Neoliberal University as an institution, namely its increasingly unaffordable character. I mean, on the one hand, we have a university system that's trying to tout itself and market itself as public and community-oriented. At the same time, it's increasingly raising tuition rates in a way that's making it increasingly inaccessible to those very communities that it now wants to serve. The problem of expenses for students is one that has opened up a whole new terrain of profit-making for banks and companies specializing in packaging student loans. Students are saddled with large debts upon graduation. I'm sure none of the students know what I'm talking about here. The possibility of receiving credit for doing service work in the community as a means of accumulating experience in the, quote, real world, unquote, has considerable appeal. However, this is more often than not an experience that is oriented toward a kind of civic engagement that eschews a critique of the very ideology of neoliberalism that contributes to the contours of inequality in the real world that we're supposed to be trying to solve. It would be hard to imagine how it could be otherwise in the real world of neoliberal higher education as it exists today, as departments and indeed entire colleges within universities are either downsized or faced with elimination. There is an increasing pressure on academics who remain to sell their fields of knowledge production to students and also to external funders. This is most effectively accomplished by conveying statistics that prove how efficient programs are in their efficient use of resources, enrollment capacity, student to slot ratios, and in outcomes, success in the job market of graduated majors, most notably. These are the so-called deliverables. Programs trip over themselves trying to outmarket each other as the most community active, community engaged, civically engaged, global citizen global citizenship oriented to attract both students and to fit the Neoliberal University brand. Finally, the Neoliberal University is one now that features the expansion of institutes and centers that are interdisciplinary and designed to be more autonomous and flexible in their functioning, however defined. You know, what have we put together, both? Something that is more now smaller, flexible, and community-oriented. A research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota. It's in this moment that we were encouraged to do this. Okay, so then why would that necessarily be a problem? The biggest challenge facing our research group is that it's a product of the very environment that supported and continues to bolster its existence, namely the neoliberal reorganization of U.S. universities. From the very moment of our inception of our research group, campus administrators have regarded it as a very worthy and important endeavor. Let me read to you from our university president, Earl Potter III, in his convocation address from 2010. He writes, "The great things that are happening are too many here, too many to mention. All but one are but one particularly relevant effort is the research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota. Initially sponsored by the College of Social Sciences, this interdisciplinary group is now co-sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts and School of Public Affairs. They also taught them the collapsing of the units and the interdisciplinary orientation of this. And it puts on its Global Goes Local conference, and it has become a signature SESU event that gives stakeholders in Minnesota's new immigrant communities an opportunity to present on panels that involve research on issues that shaped their arrival in the United States. Last year's conference was co-sponsored by the University of Minnesota's Immigration History Research Center and the United Way of Minnesota. The conference's project from which it stems are excellent examples of transdisciplinary collaboration across college lines. This is the kind of work that not only informs our teaching, but has a tremendous impact on our surrounding communities by increasing awareness of important social issues." These words of praise have been very sincere, I believe, and have been communicated for over 3 years. It was his support and the university's support was crucial in making our research group into an organization that not only could exist, but also could make an argument for its future existence as a full-fledged research center. However, this is where the future of such a center faces real challenges, if indeed it is able to realize this goal. Jean Lyotard, who is a very famous postmodernist there, through everyone here in the room that knows me, of course, knows I'm really down on postmodernism and I'm more oriented toward kind of a classical Marxist orientation of my thinking. But he happened to write some words about, as he was theorizing some of the changes that are occurring at the university back in the 80s. He used one phrase called the old faculties are now splintering into institutes as the universities lose their function of speculative legitimation. I kind of think of what's happening in the universities, the public universities. It's kind of like this response to anything big has to be broken down. And any units that are, because big units are less efficient than small units, and small units need to be broken down into units now that are both interdisciplinary but also are efficient. In other words, they're able to sustain themselves through their own efforts at securing funding, either internally or externally. And so he kind of predicted this in some of his writings, and I just like that phrase, so I just throw it in there. Ibrahim will kill me for that later. But Lyotard's words, though, they portend, again, why the university, why it is that this is so. At every stage in the brief career of our research group, St. Cloud State administrators have stressed the importance of our research group in its capacity to self-finance. Right? So that's been absolutely critical from the day this began. Right? We'll support you with a little bit of cash, but then you got to find other money to support yourself. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if I'm given the time to do that, perhaps, but I don't get any extra time to do that. I'm just given that task. Because I was so excited about doing this, I just said, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do anything you ask for. Just give me the research group and we'll start doing it. And especially if we wanted to exist in the long term, we had to prove that we were able to self-finance. That if we wanted to become a center, our center would be entirely self-financed. I've been told that at a number of points. I have no idea how that's going to be possible. But they really expect that that's where we're going to go. We're going to prove our success, and then we're going to secure this funding, and that funding will be external and will be autonomous now from the university and efficient from the vantage of our funders for the rest of eternity. In the short term, this condition has also had to be met. This autonomy has had to be met partially due to the constraints of budget cuts in the Minsky system. Since the onset of the ongoing global financial crisis, right? The neoliberal answer to everything, of course, is budget cuts, downsizing, and the like. But again, now here, again, an irony there that the disasters of neoliberalism also set up the potential for us having a space to actually make something that's called now this research group and potential future autonomous center that can do work for immigrant workers in St. Cloud and in Minnesota. The consequences for us, for our research group, as its community engagement or civic engagement mission, is that it creates boundaries as concerns the limits of the possible that otherwise might not exist. For example, the director, that's me, of the research group starts off every fiscal new year with a budget of roughly $5,000, which may or may not sound like a lot of money to you. And believe it or not, I put on a conference for about $10,000. The conference is put on with $8,000 to $10,000, depending on how many days it goes for, and critically how much food is served. The director then must be a part-time, full-time fundraiser. In addition to colloquium convener, conference organizer, and a professor who teaches 4 classes a semester, and also has a publishing agenda, and a family, and a commute of 100 miles round trip every day. This is where we see a challenge. If I collapse on the floor from a heart attack or a stroke, please continue with reading this. For the research group on immigrant workers to be able to be a research group on immigrant workers, it needs to do its collaboration in a way that expresses some level of solidarity with immigrant workers. Right? I mean, otherwise, what's the point of it being an immigrant worker-focused research group? And having a mission that expresses support and solidarity with immigrant workers. When fundraising, invariably one must find, quote, stakeholders, unquote. It's a very NGO kind of a word, right? We're looking for stakeholders to support the work of social service providers and the like. And so we need to find stakeholders in immigrant issues who would be interested in donating to a research group or future research center. Suffice it to say, outside of support that can be and is found from other college units, so I go around to all the deans, right, and put my pitch out to them about how much we're fulfilling the university mission, civic engagement, and helping the community and the like, and how good this will look for your unit to be part of this and the like. And we'll put you up on we'll mention you in the brochure. And I'll mention you at the beginning of the speech, and at the opening of the conference, and that kind of thing. So, and I'm kind of I have a little bit of a salesman kind of a part of me in me, and I like to do the pitch and to seal the deal and all that, kind of exciting. And so I don't necessarily mind going around to people I know on campus and doing that. But that's not enough. And typically I have to go off campus to find support as well. And those stakeholders typically are going to be local and statewide businesses and banks and foundations that are funded by businesses and banks, usually. Therein lies the challenge to a research group as ours. In addition to finding the time to be a fundraiser, a director, or a research group, for that matter, has to develop a pitch. Almost every business or bank that I've approached for support, and I've gone to a good number of them now, one's known to support more liberal causes within certain bounds, like Wells Fargo, Target, are immediately attracted to the idea of civic engagement that we do in our research group. However, to a T, they will all ask the same question. Anyone want to guess the question?
What's in it for us?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. How does actually they'll say more explicit? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, how does it benefit our business bank? Yeah. And what that translates into is how will, for example, a banker will ask me. I've been asked this question many times. How does this conference then, or your group, train newly arrived immigrants in how to open a bank account, or how to secure, or how to write a application for a mortgage, or how to handle their finances in a sustainable way, that kind of thing. And all I can do when they ask me that question is change the topic. Okay, great. We don't do that. Responding that it improves their public image will not suffice as a sufficient motivator. Because I've tried that. I mean, I've tried that, and I deliver that in as polished and appealing and sweet a way as possible. And then they change the topic back to the original question. So how does it? benefit us. In order to win over such, quote, stakeholders, unquote, you need to explain the work of the research group in terms of deliverables. The university president, the provost, the deans, they all use this word over and over in terms of talking about our departments and the deliverables that our departments provide. And now the research group is doing the same, has to do the same as talk about deliverables, what we deliver, what we produce, or how much value or how much bang for the buck you're going to get for this investment. And such as how many how will they learn new labor market skills, that kind of thing. There are two ways that this limits the research group's ability to fulfill its scope of its civic community engagement mission, from my vantage. One is it limits the kind of support to ones that don't challenge directly the interests of employers and lenders to immigrant workers in the St. Cloud region. There's really no way that we can, let us say immigrant workers are involved in a struggle with a meatpacking plant, go to a meatpacking plant which has itself its own, every company has their little progressive foundation, social justice foundation, community foundation, what have you, and get support for them and then turn around and sponsor panels of workers who are from that company talking about their struggles for basic rights, much less walk with them on a picket line. And secondly, it also potentially limits the kinds of research questions that can be asked. And I've been also, this has also been thrown at me by bankers. When I say bankers here, I really mean small community bankers. I don't really mean big bankers, but they'll have, what kind of research are you doing on, say, the culture of newly arrived immigrants when applying for, mortgages, and what about, say, for example, Muslims and their attitudes towards loans and lending, and is there anything that we can learn from you around that? Could we sponsor a research project on that question? To try to get them excited about now doing, research on the, experiences of workers who are involved in strikes or involved in organizing immigrant workers centers, or the effectiveness of immigrant worker centers and organizing workers, say that kind of thing. You can see where a banker or a business foundation would really not be excited about funding that kind of work. And so that's another thing that's very frustrating, is when you're looking for funding, you have to draw boundaries and insist on certain autonomy, and that will also potentially turn off investors. So I've always just kind of gone through this, right? And why does that have to be a sticky problem for us? It doesn't if we just want to ignore the interest of, say, undocumented workers and the kinds of struggles that exist between them and employers, or if we don't want to take sides or be involved in their struggles. And then there's not necessarily a conflict between what we're doing in our civic engagement and what the university thinks we should be doing, and what the banking or the business sector thinks we should be doing. But if we do think that's part of what we should be doing, then we have a potential problem. As a director of a research group, of this research group, one of the highest and most troublesome compliments I have received is on my entrepreneurship. I don't think that is a problem because there's something wrong necessarily with being an entrepreneur or being entrepreneurial. After all, the notion narrowly understood refers to one's initiative and ability to execute projects in a creative and productive fashion. Well, that's what any good organizer does, right? That spirit is shared by CEOs and union organizers and serious political activists who challenge inequalities under capitalism and even capitalism itself. Right? However, without the need to seek funding from businesses, banks, and foundations who largely are looking at issues of immigration through the lens of business promotion, profit making, the research group could potentially put its research skills to greater uses in more creative and liberating ways towards civic and community engagement. If I didn't have to spend so much time as a fundraiser, I mean, think about it. Every year, we start out with a budget of somewhere like $5,000, and then I have to find another $5,000 or so to do the conference. But it's in August
before the semester starts that I have to be making phone calls around the country to keynote speakers asking them to come to this conference. And I'm just crossing my fingers and hoping that we have $8,000 to $10,000 by spring to put on the conference and be able to pay them. And that's a very stressful situation for anyone to be in, and it distracts one from one's work. I mean, ideally, right? I mean, the justification in the Neoliberal University for having these institutes be so autonomous and the like is because that's presumably going to make them more efficient. But from my vantage, actually, it makes us less efficient because it makes us less able to do the kind of work, whether it's research or community, involvement. Primarily because we're doing now this task of fundraising and just kind of hanging out from year to year like many NGOs, right? Unable to do what? Well, concentrate on what? What is their mission? And so while I'm not necessarily unsympathetic to the critique of big institutions and big bureaucracies and the like and how they can be stultifying and also break down the potential for greater creativity, at the same time, there's something to be said for very, very well funded public universities with big budgets and big institutions that have the capacity to sustain a creative initiative like ours, which would not then be living from year to year wondering whether or not it's going to be able to do its work the following year because it has or has not met the whims of a particular banker or a particular foundation or a particular president who happens to be very close with people who are providing our external funding to the extent that we can find it. Stability has something to be said for itself for those who are organizing. And when that's not present, it makes then the work of organizing all the more difficult. And that's kind of the situation that we're in at the moment, is trying to grapple with, well, how we're going to be able to sustain this for the long term. Now, there's one other thing, which is despite my very critical perspective towards the way in which neoliberalism has undermined the potential of our work, or the work that I hoped as a director that it would do. Nonetheless, I've also still decided to go go forward with a plan to put together a worker center, an immigrant worker center in St. Cloud, which is organizing immigrant workers just like these immigrant worker centers that I brought up from the Twin Cities are doing down the Twin Cities. And that, however, given what I've talked about here, that will largely be based on my own initiative outside of the research group and outside of the university. Because of the way in which I've seen the way in which a research group or a center like this can potentially become undermined in its mission, I now want to do this work, but I want to do it off campus, and I want to be doing it with activists and with trade unionists and with immigrant workers off campus that want to put together this research group. And I want to do that work with trade unions, immigrant worker centers, and progressive foundations that will fund this kind of work. I have not yet found myself wanting to go to the university and ask the university to be involved in this project, precisely because of the kind of things that I've found the research group being oriented towards in the process of being a research group. And so while this neoliberal university has created a certain niche for me, a certain space for me to be able to do the work that we've done through the research group and this conference for 3 years, I'm not confident that the kind of work that I would want a worker center to do would necessarily receive the support that I will need to find from reliable supporters. I don't mind if banks support the worker center, but I certainly don't want the worker center to be driven by the expectations of banks or large businesses. So that's where I'm left. I mean, ironically, I'm a person who's benefited greatly from the promotion of civic engagement on the university. And yet what I now am doing, what I consider to be really the thrust of, and the reason why I got this research group going, to be honest, was not because I wanted to stop at the level of the conference work or service learning and that kind of thing. I really wanted to put together a worker center. So this conference kind of enabled me to develop networks and relationships with these folks around Minnesota who are doing good work with immigrant workers and organizing, and then get their support for this initiative up in St. Cloud. And right now I'm working, actually just this morning I got off the phone with the AFL-CIO union field rep in St. Cloud, who's working with me on putting together this immigrant worker center. and putting together a phone conference, teleconference meeting with folks at the AFL-CIO in Washington D.C. to talk about ways to get funding for and put together a worker center in St. Cloud. So we're going to continue to move forward with this, but I'm not sure that it's going to ultimately be a project that the university will be actively involved in supporting. It might. I mean, for all I know, we may actually be able to get that kind of support, but I'm just trying to be very careful about watching how I proceed with this task, given what I know about the way in which the Neoliberal University has distorted the goal of civic engagement on our campuses. So.